Hello and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Rachel Winkle and I will be your host. We're going to consider how we can prepare for multicultural and multilingual training events, whether this is for a customer-facing training event, internal training, perhaps even an e-learning course or learning support resources. Within this webinar, there are several reflective tasks planned. You can pause when you reach a task to complete it in a time frame that suits you, or you could do the task at a later date if you prefer. This webinar has previously been run as a workshop, and I will share some of the responses received to give you inspiration and a chance to see how your reflections compare to your peers in the L&D industry. We're going to cover three main areas. Firstly, the challenge of running training for multicultural and multilingual audiences. Secondly, the common mistakes that can happen. And finally, some best practices that I hope will help you moving forwards. So, I believe there are two overarching challenges faced by trainers working with global learners, which I feel are relevant for those working across the L&D and instructional design space. Firstly, the transfer of knowledge and information between different regions. And secondly, developing effective training to meet the differing needs and goals of these specific regions. Now, McKinsey recently interviewed 300 global companies and concluded that only a few of these companies actually believed they were any good at transferring knowledge and information from one region to another. And secondly, less than half of these companies were confident of the effectiveness of that training and development for those different regions. In the L&D space, we may be working with different cultures, different languages, different institutional contexts, and even different industries. So we've got lots to think about. Okay, time for our first task. I would like you to complete a short Mentimeter to reflect on questions. You can pause the video now, or you can join the Mentimeter using the code or the QR code. Or if you prefer, you can move on to the next slide with me to reveal the questions from the Mentimeter and pause the video there and write down your answers. So the questions within the Mentimeter are, firstly, what do you think are the most common mistakes in multicultural training events? Secondly, what are the most common mistakes in multilingual training events? And finally, for you, which is more challenging to prepare for, a multicultural training event or a multilingual training event? Let's take a look at what other participants answered to these questions. This will give you a chance to see how your peers responded in comparison to what your answers are. So for the first question, what are the most common mistakes in multicultural training events? I previously received answers like misunderstandings, confusion due to language, finding common ground, knowing the cultural differences that exist. I think this is a really important one. Respect that can take different forms. A lot of different cultures with different needs, which we have mentioned previously. And finally, being able to relate to the other culture, which I also think can be quite challenging, especially if the cultures are very different that you come from. The second question, what are the most common mistakes in multilingual training events? Here I received responses such as communicating difficult concepts, very challenging when you're speaking in different languages, knowing that some phrases don't translate well, checking for understanding can also be more challenging, ensuring you're understood, so a similar answer there, and also knowing what words are inappropriate to use. Great answers. And finally, which is more challenging, in your opinion, to prepare for? A multicultural audience or a multilingual audience? In the workshop I led previously, the most popular answer was multilingual, but that's not to say that that's the same for everyone. And I think this leads nicely into the common mistakes shared by Ingenuity in their 2023 report, which we're going to look at now. And this is not to say that you are making these mistakes, but I think it's useful to share these common pitfalls so that we're all aware of them and that we can be mindful of them in future training events with global customers. Let's start with a few general mistakes. So I think it's crucial to all training events, but even more important when you're training across cultures and across languages. For example, So this leads nicely into the common pitfalls shared by Ingenuity in their 2023 report. This is not to say that you're making these mistakes, but I think it is useful to share the common pitfalls so we are all aware of them and we can be mindful of them for our future training events with global customers or clients or internal training. Let's start with a few general mistakes. I think these are crucial to all training events, but even more important when training across cultures and languages. Firstly, not including the learner in the training development. In the case of my team, this will be designing a training event without conducting a training needs analysis on the attendees and gaining answers to questions like, who will be attending? Who is the key audience? What is the level of English? Or do they speak English as an additional language? This can influence, firstly, the pace of the training, if the trainer needs to plan the training in English. Secondly, the amount of time needed to engage with a platform, a product, a concept, perhaps a theory. Have they used a platform before? What was their experience? Have they worked with a similar platform, process, or perhaps concept before? Will their behavior need to change in order to use a platform, to follow a process, or to understand a theory? What are the benefits of them attending the training that you're offering? Secondly, not understanding the audience's motivation for example, purchasing a product or engaging in a process. And what's their motivation for following through on the training that you're giving to them? What's the motivation for completing the training in the first place? Understanding these motivations will be crucial to tailoring the training to meet their needs. Then there are mistakes which can occur not only in the training, but across departments too. I think these are useful to be aware of as they can be planned for and managed by a trainer if given the time and focus, and they can support other teams such as a sales team, a marketing team, an editorial team, or even product innovation. So firstly, cultural differences. These can vary a lot between different countries, even neighbouring countries, for example, cultural differences between the UK and France, which are very close. If the trainer has a lack of understanding of a culture, it is easy to cause a misunderstanding, which could lead to high memory burden or the lack of usage of a platform or product or following through on a process. Accidentally causing offence through a gesture or a particular word, colour, symbol, or even an image. Even dress code could give a negative impression to specific audiences. For example, I recently learned that the thumbs up gesture is highly offensive in some Latin American and also West African countries, so using this emoji in a training event would be a terrible idea. The same goes for the OK hand gesture in Brazil. It's a definite no-no. Next, translation. Now, translation can seem like a great idea and some learners may appreciate the effort. However, if you don't speak the language, or perhaps you cannot confirm the quality of the translation, you could be in for trouble. You may also require additional input from a native speaker, which you may not have available to you. The use of idioms, words, or phrases that don't translate to the other language need to be considered. For example, I look forward to the weekend, I look forward to playing sport, I look forward to watching Netflix. We use this phrase all the time in English, but it can be easily lost in translation if you're speaking with a Spanish speaker. So it's really important to know what phrases may not translate or could be misinterpreted in other languages. A bad translation or the use of a phrase that doesn't translate well could lead to misunderstandings, could lead to frustrations when trying to use a product or a platform or follow a process, or could lead to low usage of a product or low uptake of a process. And finally, technical. So this refers to a lack of understanding of technical issues or perhaps limitations of the country or region that you're training. For example, the region may have limited internet connectivity. Maybe this will affect your training webinars or perhaps sending over resources. There could also be limitations to access to the resources on your LMS. So you need to be really aware of what their internet standards are and how connectivity might affect those. Also, things like specific websites could be blocked, like YouTube. So video content might not be accessible, and this can spread across lots of different types of resources that you're using. So it's good to speak to, for example, HR and IT in that region and find out what issues might affect your training and or resources or e-learning courses. So let's return briefly to the Mentimeter. I would like you to reflect on your experiences to date and also how you're currently supporting multicultural and multilingual audiences. Again, you can pause the video here or during the Mentimeter. We're going to move on to the next slide now so I can reveal the questions to you. And if you're completing this task without the Mentimeter, you can pause the video now. So the first question is, which have you experienced when preparing for or during a training event? And there's a few different things to consider. For example, difficulty including attendees in the preparation, differing motivations, misunderstanding or causing offense, technical challenges, and language barriers. And the second question, what support do you currently offer to a multicultural and a multilingual audience? Let's take a look at other ratings, as this will give you a chance to see how your experiences compare to your peers. So here we can see the responses to what other peers have experienced during training events. So we can see there's quite a lot of people have experienced differing motivations from one audience to another in different regions. And then also language barriers have been faced. So perhaps a specific concept has not been understood and the trainers had to alter their training to try and reiterate the point in a different way. We've also had a range of people who've had difficulty with including attendees in preparation. There may be some blockers for different reasons. There's been some people who have experienced misunderstandings, also technical challenges. But luckily, no one's had any offences caused, which I think is probably one of the big ones that most of us already prepare for. And secondly, what support do you currently offer in multicultural and multilingual events? Let's see what other people said they're currently doing. So some people provide handouts with keynotes highlighted. I think this is a great resource because some people prefer to read information and they are able to engage with it more when it's in their second language. Sharing a recording of an event, which is great, and a lot of recording systems now offer a transcription, which I think also really helps for people who speak a different language to engage with the content being shared. Using lots of imagery, absolutely, including the transcript, like I just mentioned. Sending the presentation ahead of time, I think this is a great idea. They may begin to prepare questions that they want to ask. They may need to translate questions in preparation. And finally, adding contact details so questions can be asked after the event, another great technique. Okay, let's move on to looking at some of the best practices. So the first best practice that could be recommended is to put on a global hat. Consider your learning audience and complete a training needs analysis, or learning needs analysis as you may prefer to call it. This is something I'm working on with my team at present, designing a TNA or training needs analysis that considers the needs of multicultural and multilingual audiences specifically. A template that can be used to understand the learner's needs, their challenges, their goals, and barriers, and also the context that they're working with, prior to designing the training event or training resource or e-learning course. This could be, for example, sent as a survey, a set of questions in an email, or conducted over a call or face-to-face to gain that useful information. The goal is to avoid making any assumptions about the audience, especially if you're training for different regions. Secondly, is going to be learning culture. So understanding the culture around learning